By sunrise, the city was already uneasy. Streetlights flickered, then died. A single siren cut across the quiet highway, wailing like a warning. No one knew why. And no one could explain the emails that flooded the phones overnight, cryptic messages that hinted at changes too vast to imagine. But the real story hadn't even started. You've seen this before. A moment arrives where everything you know is suspended. Where familiar streets look different, even to the people who walk them every day. Somewhere in Silicon Valley, a man was awake. Not tossing in his bed, not scrolling through feeds. Awake in the way that feels like standing on a cliff edge, aware that something is about to fall, and maybe, something will fall because of you. He looked out of the floor-to-ceiling window of a glass tower, the city sprawling beneath him. Neon lights stretched like veins across the night. Cars crawled along highways, unaware that the ground itself was shifting beneath them, not literally, but in the way that matters more. The ground of ideas, of systems, of expectation. You know this feeling. The one where the air tastes different. Like electricity. Or fear. Or opportunity, or maybe all of it at once. He sipped his coffee, black, bitter, grounding him. The warmth didn't calm him. It reminded him of the tasks ahead. Of the calculations he had made, and the ones he hadn't yet. Somewhere in that city, offices hummed. Factories roared to life. Somewhere else, a diner flipped its last pancake before the morning rush. And the world spun, mostly unaware of the quiet storm forming behind glass and steel. But something in him was shifting. And he didn't yet know what was coming. The tweets, the press conferences, the casual offhand remarks, they weren't just words. They were keys. To what, he didn't fully admit even to himself. But they carried weight. Ripples that would stretch across states, across industries, across lives. It began quietly. A meeting, then another. Engineers, analysts, people who dreamed in code and wire, who had never touched the real pulse of the country outside their devices, suddenly became part of a narrative they didn't fully understand. Reports landed on desks. Metrics, growth charts, projections. All normal, at first glance. Then a single detail fractured everything. Numbers didn't add up. Projections ignored realities. Warnings went unheeded. And yet, the world moved on. Screens lit up in homes across the nation. Late-night TV anchors smiled, casually mentioning him, like he was a man perpetually one tweet away from chaos. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew the truth. Chaos had already begun. What he said next, half in jest, half in calculated provocation, would ripple farther than anyone imagined. America will never be the same in the next 5 years, he said. Voices laughed. Some paused. A few scribbled notes. But nobody fully grasped the weight of the statement. Nobody yet understood that the phrase wasn't a prediction, it was a blueprint. And here's the part almost no one saw, the blueprint wasn't just for technology. Not just for cars, rockets, or satellites. It was for the way people think. The way they live. The way they see themselves in the country they call home. You've asked this question too, can one person, even with resources and vision, really alter the trajectory of a nation? The answer, quietly, was already unfolding. Because change isn't polite. It doesn't knock. It doesn't wait for permission. It seeps through cracks, unnoticed at first, until one day you wake and realize that the walls you trusted are gone. And the cracks spread quietly. By the time anyone looked up, the morning had begun. The coffee was cold. Streets filled. Emails had multiplied. And the man in the glass tower? He was already planning the next move. What he found next changed everything. Not in ways that could be tweeted. Not in ways that could be explained in a headline. But in ways that would touch every diner, every highway, every late-night living room in the country. And then, nothing made sense. Because this wasn't about technology. This wasn't about companies. This wasn't even about him. This was about the moment America would begin to see itself differently. And maybe, just maybe, it had already begun. The man in the tower wasn't born extraordinary. He was born in a house where the lights flickered more than they shone. A house where the kitchen smelled of burnt toast and old coffee. Where the hum of late-night TV wasn't background, it was a companion, a witness to a child trying to understand a world too big for his small hands. You felt this once, didn't you? That sense of standing outside your own life, watching, learning, calculating, because the rules inside didn't make sense. He collected scraps of knowledge like others collected coins. Books with margins full of his tiny, sharp handwriting. Diagrams sketched on napkins at diners. Problems he couldn't solve at the time, because the world wasn't ready for him yet. There was a scar, hidden in the curve of his shoulder, where a bicycle crash had nearly ended a summer. Pain lingered not just in the body but in the memory. The lesson: speed could be thrilling. Speed could be dangerous. Speed could change everything. Highways became his meditation. Endless strips of asphalt stretching into the horizon. In his mind, each car, each truck, each flickering traffic light was a node in a network, a tiny piece of a puzzle he didn't yet know he was building. By adolescence, he had a private dream. Not a whim. Not a fleeting desire. A dream that demanded attention. A dream that whispered, "I will shape the future, even if the future doesn't want to be shaped." You know this feeling. That quiet insistence, almost defiant, that you are meant for more than the world expects. There was contradiction in him, too. He craved solitude yet thrived in chaos. He was meticulous but prone to bursts of recklessness. He feared failure, yet courted risks others wouldn't touch. And the foreshadowing was subtle, but relentless. On a quiet night in his childhood bedroom, he watched a documentary about astronauts. Rockets, distant planets, impossible ambitions. Most children saw pictures. He saw possibility. He saw systems. He saw that with enough leverage, even the stars could be bent to human will. Something in him was shifting. But he didn't know it yet. College brought more lessons, but they weren't the ones listed in textbooks. He learned that vision could intimidate, that brilliance could alienate, that a single overlooked detail could unravel months of planning. He learned to anticipate, to pivot, to maneuver quietly while appearing to do nothing at all. At first, the reports looked normal. He read them anyway. Because he believed that understanding the system, the hidden currents beneath the surface, was more important than the surface itself. And the system whispered secrets if you listened. Factory floors, computer labs, city lights at midnight, they became his teachers. Patterns emerged. People moved predictably. Markets, once abstract, revealed themselves as landscapes of emotion, fear, and desire. Yet, despite the growing mastery, the private fear lingered. What if all of it, every calculation, every strategy, every daring gamble, wasn't enough? Late-night TV anchors had joked about him. Critics dismissed him. The world oscillated between fascination and ridicule. But inside, a different truth took root. He was not immune to doubt. He was not above error. He was human, painfully, beautifully human. And that imperfection was part of the pattern. He began to test the limits. Not publicly, not yet. Small experiments in timing, messaging, and technology. Each one a tiny tremor in the network of expectation. Each one a seed for something bigger. You've asked this question too: what drives a man to shape the future while the present shakes beneath his feet? The answer is never simple. It is often invisible. And it begins here, in scraped knees, sleepless nights, diners, highways, the quiet glow of city lights reflected in a boy's eyes who refused to blink. And something was shifting again. Not the boy. Not even the man. Something in the world, something in the flow of ideas and attention, began to align with him. Subtly at first. Like the faint echo of thunder before a storm. He just didn't know what was coming. By the time the first public announcement rolled across screens, the roots were already set deep. The foundation of the next 5 years, chaotic, brilliant, unsettling, was laid in the imperfection of a human mind, and the stubborn insistence that possibility exists, even where it seems impossible. And the real tension, the kind that sticks in your chest, was just beginning to simmer. Because every system has a weak point. Every nation, a tipping point. Every dream, a shadow waiting for light. He was about to press against them all. At first, it seemed ordinary. Emails, press releases, blog posts. Words that might have been dismissed as hype. Numbers that looked normal. Headlines that reassured. And then a single detail fractured everything. Factories reported shortages. Satellites were delayed. The stock market blinked at projections that didn't add up. Analysts scratched their heads. The public, unaware, carried on with coffee, commutes, and the hum of daily life. You've seen this before. That subtle misalignment where the world seems stable, until it isn't. The man in the tower leaned back, watching the screens. Patterns emerging. Contradictions twisting. Calculations that once promised clarity now threatened chaos. At first, the reports looked normal, he thought. Then a single detail fractured everything. Many twists rippled outward. Suppliers discovered new priorities, engineers questioned assumptions, even allies began to whisper in corridors that never existed in public view. The rules were changing. Not officially. Not legally. But in the quiet, the currents shifted. Systems began to favor speed over caution, audacity over precedent, pattern over tradition. And the people? They felt it before they understood it. A CEO in Chicago paused mid-conference call, staring at graphs that no longer made sense. A driver on a highway noticed streetlights blinking in strange sequences, like a Morse code he couldn't decode. A late-night TV host joked about it, then hesitated, sensing the joke had teeth. The tension rose, not as a crescendo but as a pulse. Constant. Unrelenting. Cognitive loops formed. One anomaly led to another. One expectation broken invited another. The public, the media, the markets, they were dancing to a rhythm they hadn't written. And yet, the man in the tower remained focused. Because he knew the deeper truth. The real danger wasn't change. It was who controlled the definition of normal. You've asked this question too: who defines what's acceptable? Who decides the line between innovation and chaos? The answer is never written. It is argued, tested, disrupted. And sometimes it is decided in a single, unremarkable morning when everyone else is asleep. By midday, the first overt shifts became visible. Stock prices wavered. Tweets vanished, reappeared, then spread uncertainty. Engineers debated protocols that didn't exist yet. Factory floors echoed with confusion. Yet none of it registered as a crisis, yet. And then, a minor announcement, a partnership, a new product launch, was leaked. The public celebrated. Investors applauded. Headlines praised vision. But for those paying attention, the hidden rules had already changed. What he found next changed everything. The analysts would write later, though they wouldn't fully understand the scope until months later. Pattern breaks accelerated. Predictable cycles faltered. Data that once built confidence now seeded doubt. And doubt, subtle at first, began to gather momentum. Screens lit up. Voices sharpened. No one agreed on what was real anymore. By evening, the man walked the streets of the city, not among the chaos, but above it, observing it. Sidewalks glistened under neon reflections. Subway trains hummed in precise irregularity. People argued about what they had read, seen, or heard, while he knew the system itself was quietly pivoting beneath them. At a diner, the waitress dropped a cup. Coffee splashed. He smiled faintly. You felt this once, didn't you? That moment when reality bends just enough to make you question everything familiar? And in that pause, the lesson became clear. Expectations could be manipulated. Certainty was an illusion. Even the American way, the rhythm of cities, the pulse of highways, the comfort of late-night television, was subject to subtle recalibration. The tension wasn't in the headlines. It was in the spaces between them. By the time the night fell, and the city lights burned with their usual stubborn glow, something irreversible had happened. The pattern had shifted. The rules had bent. And the question lingered, heavy and silent. Could America recognize the change before it was too late? By midnight, the city was quiet. Quiet enough that the hum of servers, the subtle clicks of keyboards, the distant roar of trucks on highways became a chorus, a rhythm most people never noticed. And here's the part almost no one saw: what they called freedom, was quiet dependency. What they called control, was curated chaos. You know this feeling. That moment when the world you trusted begins to reveal its skeleton. And the skeleton isn't menacing, it's just honest. Brutally honest. The man in the tower didn't just observe. He orchestrated. Not in the sense of domination, but of pattern recognition, turning disparate systems into a cohesive machine. Every tweet, every market ripple, every headline was a node in a network he could see, and the network responded. It wasn't magic. It wasn't conspiracy. It was logic. And logic, when it moves faster than understanding, feels like chaos. Emails, ignored at first, became signals. Delays in factories weren't failures, they were lessons. Social media outrage wasn't randomness, it was predictability. And public perception? A system that could be nudged, gently, almost invisibly. The paradox is simple: the more people believed they were making free choices, the more predictable they became. And yet, emotion was the fuel. A mother posting about a new technology didn't know she was participating in a pattern. A driver complaining about traffic lights didn't know his frustration was recorded, measured, and mapped. Every human act, no matter how mundane, was a thread in a web larger than they realized. The system was alive, not in a sci-fi sense, but in the sense that any living thing grows according to rules you cannot always see. And the deeper truth? The growth was irreversible. You've asked this question too: how do invisible systems shape visible reality? It happens quietly. Subtly. With whispers of code, with the quiet hum of servers, with the invisible movement of attention. By morning, the first wave of realization began. Analysts pieced together anomalies that had seemed insignificant. Reporters followed leads that didn't exist in any press release. And the public? They continued with breakfast, unaware of the currents shifting beneath their routines. But some knew. And the knowing brought a sharp, almost physical awareness. Screens lit up. Notifications buzzed. Algorithms adjusted. And one realization struck deeper than the rest: the chaos was intentional. Not in malice, but in precision. Every disruption had a purpose, every anomaly a design. The reveal was uncomfortable, almost too much to grasp: the world was not broken. It was being optimized. And in optimization, there is discomfort. Because humans resist patterns they cannot name. They resist truths that feel too large. They resist change disguised as inevitability. The man in the tower watched it unfold, knowing what few understood: the next 5 years wouldn't be a series of events. They would be a metamorphosis. A shift in the way the nation understood itself, in how Americans saw their place in a connected, hyper-accelerated system. And the emotional shock? It came quietly at first. A teenage coder in Ohio realized that the system he admired had already nudged decisions in his life. A small-town mayor discovered that seemingly local economic shifts were orchestrated by unseen hands in distant towers. People who believed in independence suddenly felt the subtle tether of collective design. And the whispering truth, almost poetic in its cruelty. The world didn't notice the hands shaping it because it preferred to believe it was shaping itself. The paradox hit hardest here. The more people resisted, the more the system adapted. The more they celebrated freedom, the more it mapped their desires. The more they complained, the more precise the adjustments became. And the real shock, the emotional spike that made the entire nation pause, was this: the man in the tower had no desire to rule. Not in the traditional sense. Not politically. Not socially. He only wanted to see how far the system could bend, and how people would respond when it did. By the time dawn cracked across highways and diners, the first signs of realization shimmered in city lights. The old rules no longer applied. Every expectation had been reframed. Every assumption questioned. And the emotional gravity of that fact, felt but rarely articulated, was enormous. Because the system revealed itself not through grand gestures, but in small, almost invisible waves that reshaped reality. And the truth didn't break them. Their denial did. The storm didn't announce itself. It started in whispers. Notifications buzzed like electric rain. Tweets flared with questions no one knew how to answer. The algorithms that guided everyday life began to shift unpredictably, exposing cracks most had never noticed. Screens lit up. Voices sharpened. No one agreed on what was real anymore. And here's the truth: you can silence a voice. You can bury a truth. But you cannot stop a mind that finally learns to question. By mid-morning, the first fractures appeared in unexpected places. A suburban schoolteacher noticed her students debating ideas she hadn't taught them. Late-night diners argued politics in ways the anchors never predicted. Commuters noticed patterns in their routines, subtle nudges that made them question their own choices. Pressure waves grew. Each ripple became a tide. Engineers debated openly on forums that were usually private. CEOs reconsidered strategies mid-conference. Policymakers squinted at data that refused to behave as expected. The pattern, the invisible hand guiding the system, was no longer subtle. A teenager in Nevada tweeted an observation. "The rules are different now. I can feel it." And the storm, as all storms do, intensified. In homes across the country, quiet panic mixed with exhilaration. Parents argued with children over information sourced from unseen networks. Friends argued across group chats, each convinced of their own reality. The nation, slowly, collectively, was waking up. Identity began to fracture. People asked themselves questions they had avoided for years. Who am I in this new order? What does it mean to be free? Can the systems I trust still be trusted? And in those questions, fear took root. The man in the tower observed it all, silently. He had anticipated patterns, predicted reactions, calculated outcomes. But human emotion, messy, unpredictable, stubborn, still surprised him. Because the storm wasn't about the system itself. It was about people realizing how the system had been guiding them all along. Voices collided. Arguments erupted online and offline. Memes became philosophical statements. Algorithms propagated curiosity faster than news cycles could. Cities became laboratories. Highways carried not just cars, but ideas, spreading like wildfire in every conversation. And yet, amid the chaos, a strange clarity emerged. People began to see the mechanics of their own lives. They recognized the influence of media, of attention, of invisible patterns. They questioned the familiar rituals of work, consumption, politics. Even the comforting glow of late-night TV was now a reminder that perception could be curated. You've asked this question too: what happens when millions realize they've been moving inside a machine they cannot see? The answer was raw. Fear. Wonder. confusion, liberation. All at once. By nightfall, cities were restless. Public spaces felt charged. A quiet resistance blossomed, not organized, not even conscious, but present in glances, gestures, and questions. People were awake. For the first time, in ways both thrilling and terrifying, they were awake. And the man in the tower? He walked through the city streets unseen, noting small victories of awareness. A waitress paused mid-service to reflect on a news item. A teenager corrected an adult's assumption about technology. A commuter debated ethics with a stranger on a train. Every interaction was a microcosm of the storm. And here is the philosophical sting: the storm didn't break the nation. It revealed the nation to itself. The tension peaked, but not in chaos alone. It peaked in the awareness that everything was mutable. That what felt permanent was, in fact, fragile. The storm was not an ending. It was an awakening. And maybe, just maybe, the next 5 years, once whispered as inevitability, would become a question that every American had to answer for themselves. Because the lights flickered. Voices clashed. And the first real choices of the new era were already being made. The night softened. After the storm, the streets hummed with a quieter rhythm. Neon lights reflected off wet asphalt. Footsteps echoed in alleyways. Somewhere, a late-night diner served coffee to patrons who spoke in hushed tones, their voices tinged with new understanding. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. You've seen this before. That moment when the noise fades, when the panic subsides, when the first flickers of comprehension settle into your chest. People began to realize that change is not an event. It is a series of choices. Small decisions compounded over time, shaping the contours of life, society, and identity. The man in the tower looked down at the city one last time before dawn. He had orchestrated, guided, nudged, but never forced. The outcome was theirs, ultimately, the people's. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? The streets whispered lessons. The factories hummed quietly, patiently. Even the highway lights seemed to pulse with possibility. The nation had survived the storm, not unscathed, but awake. And maybe, this is where everything begins again. Because change, once recognized, cannot be ignored. It lingers in the way people speak, the way children dream, the way neighborhoods pulse with potential. It exists in the quiet reflection after chaos, in the small acts of understanding and courage. Somewhere, a teenager sketches designs for a future that no one can yet imagine. Somewhere, an engineer debates ethics with a peer, aware of the weight of invisible systems. Somewhere, a parent explains uncertainty to a child, not as fear, but as a call to curiosity. The storm was over. The revelation complete. And yet, the lesson remained: the future is never given. It is always taken. You felt this once, didn't you? That awareness of possibility, the thrill and the responsibility intertwined. In the quiet, the nation breathed. In the silence, reflection became action. In the pause, hope surfaced, not naive, not guaranteed, but real, fragile, human. And the man in the tower? He watched, knowing that his role was complete only insofar as the people chose to see. Beyond the screens, beyond the data, beyond the influence, the true shift belonged to them. The storm had ended, but the journey had just begun. And maybe, just maybe, this is where everything begins again. Morning arrived like a question. Not a statement. Not a promise. But a quiet, insistent, impossible to ignore question. Highways were full again. Coffee cups clinked in diners. Screens blinked alive. And yet, something was different. Something invisible. The city had survived the storm, but it was awake now. And awake cities are unpredictable. You felt this before. That sensation when the world seems familiar, yet every step forward feels uncharted. Across the country, subtle disruptions began to appear. Supply chains hesitated. Algorithms misfired. News cycles contradicted themselves mid-broadcast. And the people? They noticed. Some shrugged. Others paused. A few, the curious, the vigilant, leaned in. The man in the tower watched it all, unhurried. He had learned the rhythm of chaos, the beat of disruption, and now he tested its limits. Pattern breaks became deliberate. A tweet with a casual phrase caused speculation in forums that normally ignored him. A technical report buried in a niche journal spread like wildfire once someone noticed the anomaly. A city council's mundane decision, approving new traffic sensors, was suddenly dissected as part of a national pattern. And here's the micro-hook: no one realized the connections yet. Because the real tension wasn't in the events themselves. It was in the perception of them. Every observer became both participant and experiment. Every choice mattered in ways they could not anticipate. Every small observation became a cognitive loop. You know this feeling. When you realize you are being guided, yet every step feels voluntary. By midday, the ripple effects intensified. Stocks fluctuated not for tangible reasons, but for narratives that spread faster than evidence. Headlines collided with reality. Conversations erupted over differences that seemed trivial, until suddenly they weren't. The moral pressure was mounting. Not as a law. Not as a policy. But as a collective awareness that the world they knew had been reshaped while they slept. At a diner in Ohio, a waitress asked a regular, "Did you notice anything different this morning?" He shrugged, unsure what to say. And that shrug, so small, so ordinary, was part of a larger pattern she didn't see. It was everywhere. In the hum of factory floors. In the subtle blinking of traffic lights. In the algorithms recommending what people should read, watch, and believe. And yet, despite the disruption, the nation carried on. Americans are resilient, even when the rules are invisible. But something was shifting again. A private conversation, overheard by chance in a suburban coffee shop, revealed that a group of engineers had realized the scale of manipulation, though they lacked full understanding. They debated ethics, strategy, and responsibility, small ripples that threatened to amplify unpredictably. At the same time, in a high-rise office overlooking the city, the man in the tower scribbled equations on a whiteboard. Numbers that looked like chaos to an outsider were anything but. Every anomaly was anticipated, every human reaction mapped, every potential disruption accounted for. And yet, he felt the stirrings of something he could not fully control: human emotion. The very force that makes patterns messy, unpredictable, alive. And here's the philosophical sting: the real tension wasn't the disruption itself. It was the uncertainty of the response. By evening, the microhooks became impossible to ignore. News cycles amplified, online arguments escalated, the curious observed, and the complacent remained unaware. But the cracks in perception were spreading quietly, inevitably. And the nation, in its sprawling, chaotic beauty, had no choice but to confront the unfolding reality: nothing was as stable as it seemed. Even in the quiet moments, the dim glow of city lights, the soft clink of silverware, the flicker of screens, the tension lingered. Because this wasn't just a moment in time. It was the beginning of a narrative that would stretch across years, bending the expectations of millions. And the storm, though past, was not gone. It had transformed. Night fell again, but it carried a different weight. Not the calm of routine. Not the quiet after chaos. This was charged, electric, uneasy, alive. Across the nation, small disruptions multiplied. An expected shipment didn't arrive. Social media buzzed over a misinterpreted announcement. A city council's mundane vote sparked debates that felt larger than life. And somewhere in Ohio, a teenager realized that her small insight could ripple far beyond her bedroom. The microhooks were everywhere. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Routine. Nothing extraordinary. But that was the point. The cracks spread quietly. Almost invisible. Almost inevitable. You've seen this before. That unsettling moment when ordinary life starts to feel unpredictable, when assumptions no longer hold, and nothing can be ignored. Every anomaly revealed contradictions. A CEO announced a plan that sounded perfect, but the data suggested hidden flaws. An engineer discovered an overlooked parameter, but fixing it created new questions. Citizens debated policies they didn't understand fully, yet argued as if they did. The tension wasn't in failure. It was in expectation. People expected stability. Predictability. Certainty. And the world refused to comply. At a diner in Kansas City, the waitress noticed that every table had conversations circling the same topic. Questions repeated. Opinions clashed. Connections were made that no one could trace. And yet, the atmosphere wasn't angry. It was awake. Curious. Dangerous, in its own quiet way. Pattern breaks accelerated. An engineer in Detroit realized that her project, meant to improve traffic flow, now fed data into a system she didn't understand. A journalist in New York noticed trends that shouldn't have existed. Algorithms nudged people in directions they hadn't consciously chosen. And here's the cognitive loop: every response to disruption created new disruptions. Every action, every thought, every debate, was part of a larger unseen pattern. And the nation? The nation was learning. Slowly. Reluctantly. Mini crises began to stack. Markets jittered, but not catastrophically. Headlines collided, confusing even their writers. Politicians spoke, corrected themselves, and retracted statements. Public confidence wavered, not destroyed, but tested. And through it all, the man in the tower observed. Calm. Intense. Reflective. Because he knew the deeper lesson: the storm wasn't chaos. It was opportunity. Every contradiction was a signal. Every moral tension, a tool. Every question asked by citizens, employees, students, or parents was a clue to the next move. At the edge of the city, in a small apartment lit by the glow of screens, a student realized the implications of one anomaly: that systems could shape society silently, that influence could flow unseen, that awareness alone could alter outcomes. And the real danger, whispered, almost imperceptible, was this. The system didn't break the nation. People broke themselves, by refusing to see the patterns they were part of. By midnight, tension had peaked again. Not in explosion, but in quiet pressure. The storm had transformed into a slow, persistent weight pressing against every assumption, every belief, every expectation. The lights flickered. Screens glowed. Voices debated. No one agreed on what was real anymore. And in the stillness, one truth emerged: the real challenge wasn't the disruption. It was the awakening it demanded. Because the next 5 years, promised, feared, speculated upon, would not be defined by events alone. They would be defined by choices. And choices require clarity. The city slept, but the system never did. Servers hummed, screens glowed, and every decision, no matter how small, fed into a network invisible to those it influenced. And here's the part almost no one noticed: the disruptions weren't random. They were signals. They were lessons. They were invitations to awaken. You know this feeling. That sense that the world is bigger than your understanding, that unseen forces shape your day-to-day life in ways you can only sense, not measure. The man in the tower traced patterns across multiple screens. Graphs, networks, probabilities, threads in a web of cause and effect. Every minor anomaly, every human reaction, every contradictory headline was an input. And each input had consequences that no one fully anticipated. It wasn't manipulation in the usual sense. It wasn't domination. It was optimization, calculated, patient, relentless. And the paradox? The more people believed they were acting independently, the more their actions reinforced the system. Freedom and control existed simultaneously, yet invisibly intertwined. A software engineer in San Francisco realized a minor coding decision she made weeks ago had amplified far beyond her intent. A reporter in Atlanta published an article questioning a new technology, unaware that the framing she used nudged public perception subtly but permanently. A family in Nebraska debated dinner table politics, oblivious to how their arguments fit into larger patterns observed by analysts, journalists, and algorithms alike. And the emotional shock, the one almost no one saw coming, was simple: reality was malleable. And humans, for all their cleverness, were predictable. You've asked this question too: how much of your life is truly your own? How much is shaped by systems you cannot see? The systems moved quietly, bending without breaking, guiding without forcing. But the effects were unmistakable. Patterns emerged in traffic flows, consumer habits, social media debates, even in the tempo of city life. By mid-morning, subtle realizations spread. Citizens began noticing anomalies in their routines. Commuters realized traffic lights seemed synchronized differently. Students recognized patterns in what teachers emphasized. Social media algorithms suggested topics they hadn't asked for, nudging curiosity they didn't know they possessed. And the philosophical sting: the system was not an enemy. It was a mirror. Reflecting human behavior back at itself, amplified and precise. The man in the tower knew the next 5 years would be a test, not of technology, but of awareness. Of discernment. Of human adaptability. Across the country, microhooks continued to appear. News stories contradicted each other. Supply chains hesitated. Algorithms reshaped attention. And the public, now awake, struggled to interpret the meaning. It wasn't chaos. It was revelation. By evening, a small town in Ohio became an unexpected focal point. A local engineer discovered that data streams feeding public infrastructure were subtly adjusted in real time, not by accident, but by design. A journalist covering the story noticed anomalies that hinted at a broader system. And together, their discovery, small, seemingly insignificant, exposed the invisible architecture underlying daily life. The emotional spike hit quietly, almost imperceptibly, understanding, awe, and fear coexisting in a single moment. The real lesson? The system didn't force outcomes. It revealed choices. It exposed human patterns. It created awareness. And the paradox, almost cruel in its elegance: the system amplified independence by mapping predictability. Freedom and structure, chaos and control, existed simultaneously. By midnight, the city hummed under the invisible weight of revelation. Citizens slept fitfully. Analysts recalculated assumptions. Engineers recalibrated systems. And the man in the tower, calm, intense, reflective, watched the patterns evolve. Because the real truth wasn't what the system could do. It was what people would choose to do once they understood it. And maybe, just maybe, that choice would define the next era of America. By sunrise, the nation was unsettled. Not by a single event. Not by a dramatic headline. But by accumulation, 1,000 small shocks, unnoticed individually, yet impossible to ignore collectively. Traffic lights blinked oddly. Algorithms suggested news nobody asked for. Factories hesitated. Drones delivered packages to the wrong neighborhoods. Social media buzzed with contradictions. And somewhere, millions of Americans began to sense the invisible threads shaping their lives. Screens lit up. Voices clashed. Opinions hardened. And no one agreed on what was real anymore. You know this feeling. That subtle panic, mixed with curiosity, that tugs at your chest when you realize the world is not as simple as you thought. In small towns, big cities, diners, and highways, micro-crises unfolded. Teachers debated ethics with students who had already seen patterns. Engineers argued over system anomalies they didn't fully understand. Politicians spoke, retracted, and re-spoke. Citizens questioned their assumptions for the first time in years. And the pressure mounted. Because the disruptions weren't isolated. They weren't accidental. They were designed to reveal, to provoke, to awaken. A journalist in Chicago realized that her story about a minor traffic glitch was being interpreted as evidence of a larger system. A teenager in Oregon noticed patterns in social media nudges, linking them to seemingly unrelated events. A mayor in Florida recalculated public policy on the fly, realizing the old rules no longer applied. Every small observation became a node in a massive, invisible network. Every human response, voluntary or not, fed the system. And as awareness spread, so did tension. At the core of it all, the man in the tower observed calmly. He understood that chaos alone was insufficient. True disruption required awakening. Real impact came not from forcing change, but from nudging awareness. Pattern breaks intensified. Unexpected events collided. Contradictions proliferated. Citizens faced moral dilemmas they hadn't seen before: act or observe, trust or doubt, resist or adapt. And here's the philosophical sting: the storm didn't punish. It illuminated. By afternoon, the emotional stakes reached critical mass. Families debated ethics at dinner. Commuters questioned routines on highways. Students challenged authority in classrooms. Communities realized that predictability was a comfort, and that comfort had been orchestrated. Mini crises began stacking on one another. Supply chains faltered. Algorithms misfired. Public debate fractured into hundreds of micro-arguments. And through it all, Americans felt something they hadn't in years: agency mixed with fear, independence mixed with uncertainty. You've asked this question too: what happens when an entire society recognizes its own patterns? When the invisible scaffolding of daily life is exposed, and choices suddenly feel heavier? The answer was clear, yet unnerving: identity becomes fluid. Certainty becomes fragile. Reality becomes negotiable. At a diner in Ohio, a waitress whispered to a customer, "Have you noticed, everything feels different?" He nodded slowly, unease etched in his face. And that small acknowledgement, so ordinary, so human, was a spark in the storm. By evening, cities vibrated with awareness. Algorithms, humans, and systems interacted in unpredictable ways. Every choice created ripples. Every action shifted outcomes. And the moral pressure, individual, collective, unavoidable, was palpable. The storm didn't need explosions or chaos. It existed in realization. In understanding. In awakening. And here's the truth: the storm didn't break the nation. It revealed it to itself. And in that revelation, the nation faced its first real test, not of survival, but of understanding. Not of obedience, but of discernment. Not of fear, but of choice. The storm had returned. But this time, it was bigger, deeper, and more human. Because the next 5 years would not be dictated by events alone. They would be defined by decisions made in the eye of the storm. Night settled slowly, but it felt different this time. Not empty. Not silent. But aware. Conscious. The storm had passed, or at least, it had paused. Coffee cups cooled in diners. Streetlights reflected in puddles from a midday rain. Screens glimmered softly in living rooms and offices. People moved through their routines, but now with a subtle attentiveness, a careful curiosity. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. And you felt it, the quiet weight of awareness. That moment when you realize the world is not only what it seems, but what you choose to make of it. The micro-hooks of the day lingered. Small anomalies, once unnoticed, became conversation topics. A traffic pattern adjusted overnight. An algorithm suggested unexpected news. A teacher emphasized an unusual subject. And citizens noticed. Awareness had a rhythm now. A cadence. A pulse. You've seen this before. That moment when panic gives way to reflection, when curiosity begins to outweigh fear, when the first threads of understanding are woven into the fabric of daily life. Across the country, subtle changes began. Families discussed ethics over dinner. Students debated history with nuance. Engineers recalculated assumptions. Journalists questioned not only facts, but frameworks. And in quiet corners, communities began noticing that their small choices carried weight. The man in the tower observed, as always. Calm, intense, reflective. He understood that systems alone could not shape outcomes. Awareness did. Intent did. Deliberation did. By mid-evening, the city streets carried a new energy. Commuters paused longer at crosswalks, noticing patterns in traffic lights. A mother corrected herself mid-instruction, realizing her assumptions were guided by unseen norms. A teenager noticed that a seemingly trivial observation could ripple unexpectedly. And the philosophical echo became clear: the storm had not destroyed. It had revealed. It revealed human potential. Human responsibility. Human agency. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? In the quiet, lessons emerged. Systems, once opaque, were now glimpsed. Patterns, once invisible, were now recognized. And choices, once automatic, were now deliberate. And maybe, just maybe, the next 5 years wouldn't feel like a passive passage of time. Maybe they would feel like an invitation. An opportunity. A challenge. Even the small acts, turning off a screen to read, questioning assumptions, speaking with intention, carried significance. Awareness had become contagious. Curiosity, purposeful. Reflection, habitual. The storm had ended not in catastrophe, but in consciousness. And the man in the tower knew this: the real work was just beginning. Because revelation, like freedom, is not a state. It is a practice. And somewhere in the city, in homes, offices, diners, and classrooms, a subtle shift persisted: the understanding that what comes next, chaos or calm, despair or hope, would be shaped by human choice. And maybe, this is where everything begins again. Morning arrived heavy, unlike any routine sunrise. The air itself seemed to carry tension, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. Traffic lights blinked in unusual patterns. Delivery drones rerouted without explanation. Algorithms nudged people toward content they didn't expect. And somewhere, millions began sensing the hidden hand guiding these small anomalies. You've felt this before. That prickling awareness when ordinary life suddenly seems orchestrated, and you realize you are part of a system far larger than yourself. Across cities, towns, and highways, contradictions multiplied. A policy announced in Washington conflicted with local directives. Stock prices fluctuated seemingly at random, while analysts insisted there was a logic no one could yet see. Social media buzzed with confusion, and in living rooms across the country, families debated not what was true, but what felt true. The moral pressure was mounting. Teachers confronted students who challenged the very assumptions of the curriculum. Engineers debated decisions that could ripple far beyond their projects. Citizens questioned laws, norms, even the routines of daily life. And everywhere, subtle anomalies fed awareness like sparks in dry brush. At a diner in Missouri, a waitress observed her regulars arguing not about events themselves, but the implications behind them. "They're all connected somehow," one said, almost to himself. And that observation, so ordinary, so human, echoed a truth few dared voice: patterns exist even when unseen. Pattern breaks became more pronounced. A software glitch disrupted municipal services in Chicago. An unexpected audit in Atlanta revealed inconsistencies that challenged public confidence. Commuters noticed subtle changes in traffic flow that defied prior logic. And as awareness spread, tension intensified. And here's the micro-hook: every reaction, voluntary or not, became part of the system. Every choice amplified consequences, and every assumption was now under scrutiny. The man in the tower observed calmly. Intense. Reflective. Patient. He understood that real disruption didn't require chaos. It required awareness, awareness that created uncertainty, and uncertainty that forced deliberation. By midday, mini-crises compounded. Supply chains faltered, not catastrophically, but enough to make citizens notice. News stories contradicted themselves. Analysts disagreed in real time. Public confidence wavered, not destroyed, but tested. And through it all, Americans were learning. Slowly. Reluctantly. Necessarily. Every anomaly prompted reflection. Every contradiction sparked debate. Every misalignment of expectation and outcome forced choices, and choices carried weight. You've asked this question too: what happens when people recognize the patterns shaping their lives? When the scaffolding beneath daily life becomes visible? The answer was unsettling: identity becomes fluid. Certainty becomes fragile. Reality becomes negotiable. And yet, in that uncertainty, power resides, not in the systems themselves, but in the humans who perceive them. By evening, the tension had reached a new plateau. The storm had evolved. Not destroyed, but transformed into moral and cognitive pressure. Citizens argued, observed, adapted, and questioned. Families debated ethics at dinner tables. Students challenged authority. Communities confronted the invisible architecture guiding them. And here's the philosophical sting: the tension was not a threat. It was an invitation. The nation faced its first true moral reckoning, not of laws, not of politics, but of awareness. Every small decision became significant. Every perception mattered. And the next 5 years would be shaped less by events, and more by the choices made in the eye of this awakening. Because the storm had never really left. It had evolved. And it was alive in every observation, every reflection, every choice. Night settled slowly, but it carried weight. Not the silence of routine. Not the quiet of exhaustion. This was aware. Conscious. Attentive. The storm had paused, or at least, its chaos had. Streetlights glimmered off wet pavement. Neon signs reflected in puddles. Coffee cups cooled in diners. Screens glimmered softly in living rooms and offices. People moved through their routines, but now with subtle attentiveness, a careful curiosity. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. And you felt it, the quiet weight of awareness. That moment when you realize the world is not only what it seems, but what you choose to make of it. The small anomalies from the past day lingered. Traffic patterns shifted subtly. Algorithms suggested unexpected news. Teachers emphasized unusual subjects. And citizens noticed. Awareness had a rhythm now. A cadence. A pulse. You've seen this before. That moment when panic gives way to reflection, when curiosity outweighs fear, when the first threads of understanding weave into daily life. Across the country, subtle adaptations appeared. Families discussed ethics over dinner. Students debated history with nuance. Engineers recalculated assumptions. Journalists questioned not only facts, but frameworks. And in quiet corners, communities realized that small choices carried weight. The man in the tower observed, as always. Calm, intense, reflective. He knew systems alone could not shape outcomes. Awareness did. Intent did. Deliberation did. By mid-evening, city streets carried a new energy. Commuters paused longer at crosswalks, noticing patterns in traffic lights. A mother corrected herself mid-instruction, realizing assumptions were guided by unseen norms. A teenager recognized that a seemingly trivial observation could ripple far beyond its origin. And the philosophical echo became clear: the storm had not destroyed. It had revealed. It revealed human potential. Human responsibility. Human agency. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? In the quiet, lessons emerged. Systems, once opaque, were glimpsed. Patterns, once invisible, were recognized. Choices, once automatic, became deliberate. And maybe, just maybe, the next 5 years wouldn't feel like a passive passage of time. Maybe they would feel like an invitation. An opportunity. A challenge. Even the smallest acts, turning off a screen to read, questioning assumptions, speaking with intention, carried significance. Awareness had become contagious. Curiosity, purposeful. Reflection, habitual. The storm had ended not in catastrophe, but in consciousness. And the man in the tower knew this: the real work was just beginning. Because revelation, like freedom, is not a state. It is a practice. And somewhere in homes, offices, diners, and classrooms across the nation, a subtle shift persisted: the understanding that what comes next, chaos or calm, despair or hope, would be shaped by human choice. And maybe, this is where everything begins again. Morning arrived heavy. Not with sunlight, not with calm, but with expectation. Something had shifted. Something imperceptible yet undeniable. Highways were clogged with commuters who noticed small anomalies. Traffic lights blinked oddly. Algorithms suggested news nobody asked for. Supply chains faltered in ways that didn't make sense. And citizens began sensing the invisible scaffolding shaping their lives. You felt this before. That subtle tension when ordinary life feels orchestrated, and you realize your choices are part of a system far larger than yourself. Across towns and cities, contradictions multiplied. A federal policy clashed with local directives. Stock prices fluctuated for reasons no analyst could fully explain. Social media discussions spiraled, not over facts, but over interpretations of patterns. Families debated what true meant. The moral pressure intensified. Teachers confronted students challenging assumptions. Engineers debated technical decisions with consequences that rippled far beyond their projects. Politicians spoke, corrected themselves, and then re-spoke. Citizens questioned norms they had taken for granted. And everywhere, subtle anomalies sparked awareness like sparks in dry brush. At a diner in Missouri, a waitress overheard a conversation. "They're all connected somehow," said a man, sipping his coffee. And that observation, so ordinary, so human, echoed a truth few dared voice: unseen patterns exist, shaping lives in ways no one fully understands. Pattern breaks accelerated. A software glitch disrupted municipal services in Chicago. An unexpected audit in Atlanta revealed inconsistencies that challenged public confidence. Commuters noticed subtle changes in traffic flows. And as awareness spread, tension intensified. And here's the micro-hook: every reaction, voluntary or not, became part of the system. Every choice amplified consequences, every assumption was under scrutiny. The man in the tower observed. Calm. Intense. Reflective. He understood real disruption didn't require chaos. It required awareness, awareness that created uncertainty, and uncertainty that forced deliberation. By midday, many crises compounded. Supply chains faltered. News stories contradicted each other. Analysts debated in real time. Public confidence wavered, not destroyed, but tested. And Americans were learning. Slowly. Reluctantly. Necessarily. Every anomaly prompted reflection. Every contradiction sparked debate. Every misalignment of expectation and outcome forced choices, and choices carried weight. You've asked this question too: what happens when people recognize the patterns shaping their lives? When the scaffolding beneath daily life becomes visible? The answer was unsettling. Identity becomes fluid. Certainty becomes fragile. Reality becomes negotiable. And yet, in that uncertainty, power resides, not in the systems themselves, but in the humans who perceive them. By evening, tension reached a new plateau. The storm had evolved, not destruction, but moral and cognitive pressure. Citizens argued, observed, adapted, questioned. Families debated ethics at dinner tables. Students challenged authority. Communities confronted the invisible architecture guiding them. And the philosophical sting, the tension was not a threat. It was an invitation. The nation faced its first true moral reckoning, not of law, not of politics, but of awareness. Every choice carried weight. Every perception mattered. The next 5 years would be shaped not by events, but by decisions made in the eye of this awakening. Because the storm had never really left. It had evolved. And it was alive in every observation, every reflection, every choice. Night fell, but the city wasn't asleep. It moved quietly beneath layers of awareness, beneath the hum of servers, beneath the patterns of human behavior that had grown perceptible yet remained unseen. And here's the part almost no one noticed: the disruptions weren't random. They were orchestrated signals, lessons, and provocations all at once. Not to control, but to reveal. You know this feeling. That sense of awakening when the world shows itself differently, when you realize your actions matter more than you thought, and your inaction has consequences you hadn't anticipated. The man in the tower observed patterns spanning coast to coast. Graphs, networks, algorithms, behaviors, all threads woven into a massive tapestry. Each anomaly, each contradiction, each decision fed into a larger invisible architecture. And the architecture reflected humans back to themselves. The paradox: freedom and control existed simultaneously. Awareness and predictability were intertwined. The more people believed they acted independently, the more their actions reinforced the system. In San Francisco, a software engineer realized a minor coding adjustment she made weeks ago had far-reaching consequences. In Atlanta, a journalist wrote a story questioning new policies, unaware that her framing nudged public perception subtly but permanently. In rural Nebraska, a family debated dinner table ethics, oblivious to how their conversation fit into a broader pattern. The emotional shock: reality was malleable. Humans were predictable. And the choices that seemed small carried immense, often invisible weight. Every human response, voluntary or accidental, became input. Every choice reshaped outcomes. And every contradiction revealed deeper truths about the systems governing daily life. By mid-morning, microhooks spread. Citizens noticed anomalies in routines. Commuters observed traffic lights shifting subtly. Students questioned not only lessons, but the underlying assumptions. Social media suggested topics, not answers, nudging curiosity, awareness, reflection. And the philosophical sting: the system was not an enemy. It was a mirror. A reflection of human behavior, amplified, precise, undeniable. The man in the tower knew the next 5 years would be a test, not of technology, but of awareness. Not of obedience, but discernment. Not of fear, but conscious choice. Across the country, hidden levers revealed themselves in micro-crises. News contradicted itself. Supply chains hesitated. Algorithms reshaped attention. And people, now awake, struggled to interpret the implications. It wasn't chaos. It was revelation. By evening, a small town in Ohio became an unexpected focal point. A local engineer discovered data streams feeding public infrastructure were subtly adjusted in real time, not by accident, but by deliberate design. A journalist noticed anomalies pointing to a broader system. And together, their discovery, small yet significant, exposed invisible forces shaping society. The emotional spike hit quietly, almost imperceptibly, awe, fear, realization all coexisting in a single moment. The real lesson: the system didn't enforce outcomes. It revealed them. It exposed human patterns. It created awareness. And the paradox, elegant and unsettling, the system amplified independence by mapping predictability. Freedom and structure, chaos and control, they coexisted invisibly. By midnight, the city hummed under the invisible weight of revelation. Citizens slept fitfully. Analysts recalculated assumptions. Engineers recalibrated systems. And the man in the tower, calm, intense, reflective, watched patterns evolve. Because the truth wasn't what the system could do. It was what humans would choose once they understood it. And maybe, that choice would define the next era of America. By dawn, America stirred uneasily. Not from alarm, not from catastrophe, but from realization. The invisible threads had been revealed, and suddenly, every action, every choice, every belief felt consequential. Screens flickered. Headlines contradicted themselves. Algorithms nudged thoughts that felt like intuition. Streets pulsed with people noticing anomalies they had never questioned before. And in offices, homes, classrooms, and diners, citizens wrestled with patterns they hadn't consciously seen. You felt this before. That quiet tremor in your chest when you recognize that reality is both familiar and strange, that every decision carries weight, and that understanding itself is a responsibility. In towns across the Midwest, families debated ethics at the dinner table. In New York, engineers recalculated infrastructure in real time, uncertain whether assumptions were valid. In Los Angeles, journalists questioned frameworks as often as facts. Everywhere, microcrises collided, exposing contradictions in systems previously taken for granted. The moral pressure was relentless. Teachers faced students challenging not only curriculum, but the assumptions behind it. Politicians revised statements mid-speech, aware that words carried unseen consequences. Citizens questioned norms, laws, and routines. And through it all, subtle disruptions, traffic anomalies, social media nudges, unexpected news, provoked reflection. At a diner in Ohio, a waitress noticed her regulars speaking not about events, but about meaning. "They all connect somehow," said one. And in that ordinary observation, a truth emerged: unseen systems mirrored human behavior, reflecting not just patterns, but choices. Pattern breaks intensified. Supply chains hesitated. Algorithms misfired. Public confidence wavered, not destroyed, but recalibrated. Every small action, every conversation, every click carried amplified significance. And here's the microhook: the storm wasn't external. It was internal. The man in the tower observed patiently, as always. Calm, intense, reflective. He understood that real disruption didn't need chaos. It required awareness, awareness that forced deliberation, that tested judgment, that demanded responsibility. By afternoon, emotional pressure peaked. Identity crises unfolded. Individuals recognized how much their lives were shaped by invisible forces. Communities confronted contradictions between perception and reality. And citizens grappled with moral dilemmas: act or observe, trust or doubt, resist or adapt. You've asked this question too: what happens when an entire society recognizes its own patterns? When the scaffolding of daily life becomes visible? The answer was unsettling: certainty became fragile. Reality became negotiable. Identity became fluid. And yet, in that uncertainty, power resided, not in the systems, but in the humans perceiving them. By evening, tension reached a new height. Families debated ethics, students challenged authority, communities confronted invisible architecture. And in every interaction, the weight of awareness pressed like gravity. The philosophical sting: the storm didn't punish. It illuminated. It revealed. It demanded consciousness. Because the next 5 years wouldn't be shaped by events alone. They would be defined by choices made in the eye of this awakening. And as the night deepened, the realization settled, the storm had never really left. It had evolved. And it existed in every observation, every reflection, every decision. Night had deepened, and the city breathed differently. Not quietly. Not passively. But thoughtfully. Consciously. After the storm, a strange calm emerged. Not relief, not resolution, but awareness. Streetlights glimmered off rain-soaked sidewalks. Coffee cups sat cooling on diner tables. Screens glimmered softly, reflecting faces deep in thought. People moved through routines differently now, noticing what had previously gone unseen. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. And you felt it, the weight of awareness, that quiet understanding that reality is neither fixed nor simple, and that what you choose matters. The anomalies of the past days lingered. Traffic patterns shifted subtly. Algorithms nudged unpredictably. News cycles contradicted themselves. And in homes, offices, diners, and classrooms, people adapted, recalibrating assumptions and actions. You've seen this before. That moment when tension gives way to reflection, when curiosity outweighs fear, when the first threads of understanding are woven into the fabric of daily life. Across the nation, subtle adaptations emerged. Families discussed ethics at dinner. Students debated history with nuance. Engineers recalculated projects with an eye toward systemic consequences. Journalists questioned not only facts but the frameworks behind them. Communities noticed that even small choices could ripple far beyond their immediate surroundings. The man in the tower observed. Calm. Intense. Reflective. He knew that systems alone could not shape outcomes. Awareness did. Intent did. Deliberation did. By mid-evening, city streets carried a different energy. Commuters paused at crosswalks, noticing subtle shifts in traffic lights. A mother reconsidered instructions mid-sentence, aware of her assumptions. A teenager realized that a single observation could ripple in ways previously unimaginable. And the philosophical echo became clear: the storm had not destroyed. It had revealed. It revealed human potential. Human responsibility. Human agency. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? Even the smallest acts, turning off a screen to read, questioning assumptions, speaking with intention, carried significance. Awareness had become contagious. Curiosity, purposeful. Reflection, habitual. The storm had ended not in chaos, but in consciousness. And the man in the tower knew this: the real work was just beginning. Because revelation, like freedom, is not a state. It is a practice. And somewhere, across cities, towns, diners, offices, and classrooms, a subtle shift persisted, the understanding that what comes next, chaos or calm, despair or hope, would be shaped by conscious human choice. And maybe, this is where everything begins again. Morning arrived gray, heavy with unspoken questions. The calm of reflection hadn't lasted long. Awareness, once awakened, demanded engagement. Citizens sensed subtle pressures in routines that previously felt automatic. Streetlights blinked differently. Algorithms nudged not only content, but behavior. Supply chains moved irregularly, almost imperceptibly. And across the nation, people noticed. You felt this before. That uneasy certainty that life is no longer ordinary, that every choice, small or large, carries weight beyond comprehension. Contradictions multiplied. Local and federal policies seemed misaligned. Social media suggested narratives nobody consciously followed. Analysts argued in real time. News outlets contradicted themselves. Families debated morality at dinner tables. And students questioned not only lessons, but the assumptions behind them. The moral pressure mounted. Teachers confronted students challenging the framework of education. Engineers faced design decisions whose consequences rippled unseen. Politicians revised speeches mid-delivery, aware that every word had amplified impact. Citizens questioned habits, routines, and social norms, uncertain which path was ethical or effective. At a diner in Pennsylvania, a waitress noticed a quiet conversation among regulars. "It's all connected," one said, pointing at a weathered notebook filled with observations. And in that ordinary comment, a truth crystallized: invisible systems mirrored human patterns, amplifying not only actions, but intentions. Pattern breaks escalated. Traffic routes adjusted unexpectedly. Algorithms suggested topics that seemed almost prophetic. Municipal services hesitated, testing patience and observation. And as awareness spread, tension intensified. Here's the microhook: the storm wasn't external, it was embedded in everyday life. The man in the tower observed calmly. Intense. Reflective. He knew that true disruption didn't require overt chaos. It required awareness, awareness that forced humans to question, deliberate, and act responsibly. By midday, emotional pressure peaked. Identity crises emerged. Individuals realized their assumptions shaped not just their lives, but entire communities. Communities confronted contradictions between perception and reality. Citizens wrestled with moral dilemmas: intervene or observe, trust or question, comply or resist. You've asked this question too: what happens when an entire society perceives its own patterns? When the scaffolding of daily life becomes visible? The answer was unsettling: certainty became fragile. Reality became negotiable. Identity became fluid. And yet, in that uncertainty, power resided, not in the systems themselves, but in the humans perceiving them. By evening, tension reached a new height. Families debated ethics, students challenged authority, communities confronted unseen architecture. And in every interaction, the weight of awareness pressed like gravity. The philosophical sting: the tension didn't punish. It illuminated. It revealed. It demanded consciousness. Because the next 5 years wouldn't be shaped by events alone. They would be defined by choices made in the eye of this awakening. And as the night deepened, it became clear: the storm had never truly left. It had evolved. And it existed in every observation, reflection, and decision. Night settled again, but it carried a different weight this time. Not quiet. Not still. But deliberate. Conscious. What most people called chaos was something else entirely. Something precise. A system humming beneath the surface, responsive, observant, and unerringly human in its design. And here's the part almost no one saw: the patterns shaping daily life weren't imposed, they were mirrored. Every anomaly, every micro-crisis, every unexpected glitch reflected human behavior back to itself. The system didn't control. It revealed. You know this feeling. That quiet shock when you realize what you assumed to be random is intentional, or at least, predictable. That your actions, your decisions, even your doubts, are threads in a tapestry you hadn't noticed. Across the nation, connections emerged. A data stream in Seattle intersected with a municipal update in Austin. A teenager's post in Florida amplified a subtle shift in consumer behavior in New York. Analysts noted correlations that didn't exist on paper, but were undeniable in practice. The paradox revealed itself clearly: freedom and influence, independence and predictability, coexist. The more humans believed they acted freely, the more their actions reinforced the system. And the more the system reflected reality, the more humans learned to adjust, adapt, and question. At a diner in Kansas, a waitress overheard a discussion among patrons. "They're not controlling us," one said quietly. "They're showing us who we are." And there it was, the revelation. The system wasn't a master. It was a mirror. It amplified awareness, nudged curiosity, demanded reflection. And it waited to see what humans would do with it. By mid-morning, subtle disruptions accelerated. Traffic rerouted unexpectedly. Algorithms suggested patterns in personal behavior. News cycles contradicted themselves again, but this time, readers noticed. They questioned not only the story but the underlying framework. The emotional shock deepened. Humans weren't being manipulated, they were being confronted with themselves. Every small choice, every seemingly insignificant action, carried amplified weight. And here's the microhook: the true power wasn't in the system. It was in human awareness. In deliberate observation. In reflection. In choice. By afternoon, society began to respond in quiet, remarkable ways. Communities adjusted local policies to reflect subtle behavioral patterns. Engineers recalculated designs not because of regulations, but because they recognized human dependency in the system. Families debated ethics with an awareness that rippled beyond the table. The philosophical sting: reality was neither rigid nor fixed. It was responsive. It was adaptive. It demanded consciousness. The man in the tower observed calmly. Intense. Reflective. Patient. He understood the paradox: the system's power lay not in control, but in reflection. Not in enforcement, but in revelation. By evening, cities hummed under a new awareness. Citizens slept fitfully, dreaming not of fear, but of understanding. Analysts recalculated assumptions. Engineers prepared for ripple effects they could anticipate but not fully control. And the man in the tower, always watching, knew the next 5 years would be shaped not by technology, but by perception. Because the truth wasn't what the system could do. It was what humans would choose once they recognized it. And maybe, that choice would define an era. The morning air carried a tension that wasn't visible, but palpable. Not in the streets, not in the sky. But in awareness itself. People moved differently. Thought differently. Questioned differently. The invisible system beneath daily life had revealed itself, and citizens now recognized that even small choices rippled far beyond their understanding. You felt this before. That uneasy knowledge that you are both actor and observer in a world far larger than yourself. That awareness itself carries weight: ethical, emotional, personal. Across the country, contradictions collided. Local policies clashed with federal directives. Supply chains faltered subtly. Algorithms nudged behavior unpredictably. Social media amplified questions, not answers. Families argued ethics at dinner tables. Students challenged authority, not for rebellion, but for clarity. The moral pressure was relentless. Teachers confronted students who questioned not only lessons, but the system's underlying education. Engineers debated projects knowing even minor changes could cascade. Politicians spoke, corrected themselves, and re-spoke, aware their words carried amplified consequences. Citizens, once passive, questioned assumptions, routines, and long-held norms. In a diner in Michigan, a waitress overheard a quiet conversation. "It's not chaos," said one patron. "It's reflection. It's forcing us to see ourselves." Pattern breaks accelerated. Traffic misaligned. News contradicted itself. Algorithms suggested patterns that seemed almost prophetic. And every observation carried significance. Awareness became pressure. Insight became weight. Here's the microhook: the storm wasn't external. It was internal. Embedded in consciousness, in perception, in choice. The man in the tower observed calmly. Intense. Reflective. He knew the true storm required no spectacle. No destruction. Awareness alone, sharpened, deliberate, conscious, was enough to test identity, morality, and resilience. By midday, emotional pressure peaked. Identity crises unfolded quietly. Individuals realized their lives were entwined with invisible forces. Communities confronted contradictions between perception and reality. Citizens wrestled with ethical dilemmas: intervene or observe, trust or question, comply or resist. You've asked this question too: what happens when an entire society sees its own scaffolding? The answer was unsettling: certainty became fragile. Reality negotiable. Identity fluid. And yet, in that uncertainty, power resided, not in the systems, but in the humans perceiving them. By evening, tension reached a new crescendo. Families debated ethics. Students challenged authority. Communities confronted invisible architecture. And in every interaction, the weight of awareness pressed like gravity. The philosophical sting: the storm didn't punish. It illuminated. It demanded consciousness. It exposed not vulnerability, but potential. Because the next 5 years wouldn't be shaped by events alone. They would be defined by choices made in the eye of this awakening. And as night deepened, the realization settled: the storm had never left. It had evolved. It existed in every reflection, every decision, every observation. Night settled gently, though the city felt different. Not silent. Not asleep. But aware. Conscious. Reflective. The storm had passed, not destroyed, but illuminated. Citizens had glimpsed the invisible threads weaving daily life together, and now they moved with new deliberation. Small actions carried weight. Minor decisions rippled further than ever before. And the awareness lingered, persistent and quiet, like an echo. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. Streetlights glimmered off wet asphalt. Coffee cups cooled on diner tables. Screens reflected faces deep in thought. Across neighborhoods and cities, people noticed small changes in their routines, choices they had never questioned before. You felt this before. That sense of awakening when the ordinary becomes meaningful. When small acts, unnoticed for years, suddenly matter. When curiosity outweighs inertia. Families discussed ethics at dinner. Students debated history with nuance. Engineers recalculated designs, aware of broader consequences. Journalists questioned not only facts, but frameworks. And communities adapted to subtle patterns revealed by recent disruptions. At a diner in Colorado, a waitress observed a small conversation among locals. "We see it now," one said softly. "It's not control. It's reflection." The man in the tower watched. Calm. Intense. Reflective. He understood the paradox: systems cannot enforce choice. Awareness does. Deliberation does. Intent does. By mid-evening, subtle shifts continued. Commuters paused at crosswalks, noticing traffic flow differently. A parent reconsidered instructions mid-sentence. A student realized a single observation could ripple unexpectedly. And the philosophical echo became clear: the storm had not punished. It had revealed human potential. Human responsibility. Human agency. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? Even the smallest acts, reading instead of scrolling, questioning assumptions, speaking with intention, carried significance. Awareness had become contagious. Reflection habitual. Curiosity purposeful. The storm's aftermath was not chaos. It was consciousness. And the man in the tower knew this: the real work had only begun. Because revelation, like freedom, is not a state. It is a practice. And somewhere, across cities, towns, diners, offices, classrooms, a subtle shift persisted: the understanding that the next 5 years would be shaped not by circumstance, but by conscious human choice. And maybe, this is where everything begins again. Morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of light that exposes imperfections. The calm of reflection had shifted. Awareness, once a quiet revelation, now carried tension. People moved deliberately, thought deliberately, and even small decisions felt amplified. You felt this before. That tightness in your chest when you realize the world is both familiar and strange, that your actions, your choices, carry weight far beyond what you imagined. Across America, contradictions multiplied. Local policies conflicted with federal directives. Supply chains faltered subtly, imperceptibly. Algorithms nudged behaviors in ways that felt like intuition. Social media amplified questions, not answers. Families debated ethics at dinner tables. Students challenged authority, not for rebellion, but for clarity. The moral pressure intensified. Teachers faced students questioning not only lessons but the assumptions behind them. Engineers debated project decisions knowing minor changes could cascade unseen. Politicians rephrased speeches mid-delivery, aware every word had consequences magnified by awareness. Citizens questioned long-held norms and routines, unsure which path was ethical or correct. At a diner in Missouri, a waitress noticed a quiet conversation among patrons. "They're not controlling us," one said. "They're showing us who we are." Pattern breaks accelerated. Traffic misaligned. Algorithms suggested trends that seemed almost prophetic. And awareness spread. Insight became pressure. Observation became weight. Here's the microhook: the tension wasn't external. It was embedded in perception, in consciousness, in choice. The man in the tower observed calmly. Intense. Reflective. He knew the real test required no chaos, no spectacle. Awareness alone, sharpened, deliberate, conscious, was enough to challenge identity, morality, and resilience. By midday, emotional pressure peaked. Identity crises unfolded quietly. Individuals realized their lives were intertwined with invisible forces. Communities confronted contradictions between perception and reality. Citizens wrestled with ethical dilemmas: intervene or observe, trust or question, comply or resist. You've asked this question too: what happens when an entire society sees its own scaffolding? The answer was unsettling: certainty became fragile. Reality negotiable. Identity fluid. And yet, in that uncertainty, power resided, not in the systems, but in the humans perceiving them. By evening, tension reached a crescendo. Families debated ethics. Students challenged authority. Communities confronted invisible architecture. Every interaction carried weight, and awareness pressed like gravity. The philosophical sting: the tension didn't punish. It illuminated. It demanded consciousness. It exposed not weakness, but potential. Because the next 5 years wouldn't be shaped by events alone. They would be defined by choices made in the eye of this awakening. And as night fell, it became clear: the tension had never truly left. It had evolved. It existed in every reflection, every decision, every observation. Night came again, but it was different this time. Not quiet. Not still. Deliberate. Intentional. What most people called chance, randomness, or error was something else entirely: a reflection. A pattern. A system mirroring human behavior back to itself. Every anomaly, every glitch, every ripple revealed a larger truth: humans were both the input and the output. And here's the part almost no one noticed: the system didn't act to control. It acted to reveal. You know this feeling. That quiet shock when you realize that what seems random is intentional, or at least, predictable. That your smallest actions, your decisions, your doubts, are threads in a tapestry you hadn't noticed. Across the nation, connections emerged like electrical currents. A software tweak in Seattle caused minor shifts in New York's urban systems. A teenager's social post in Florida echoed across platforms, nudging behaviors that weren't intended but predictable. Analysts noticed correlations that didn't exist on paper but manifested clearly in practice. The paradox: freedom and predictability coexisted. The more humans believed they acted independently, the more their actions reinforced the system. Awareness and reflection amplified influence. Choice, once thought private, became a visible force. At a diner in Vermont, a waitress overheard a quiet conversation among locals. "They're not controlling us," said one. "They're showing us who we are." And there it was, the revelation. The system wasn't a master. It was a mirror. It amplified reflection, nudged curiosity, demanded deliberation, and waited to see what humans would do with it. By mid-morning, subtle disruptions accelerated. Traffic rerouted unexpectedly. Algorithms suggested patterns in human behavior that seemed almost intuitive. News cycles contradicted themselves, but now, readers noticed. They questioned not only the story but the underlying framework. The emotional shock: humans weren't being manipulated, they were being confronted with themselves. Every small action, every seemingly insignificant choice, carried amplified weight. And here's the microhook: the true power wasn't in the system. It was in human awareness. In conscious observation. In deliberate reflection. In choice. By afternoon, society began responding. Communities adjusted local policies to reflect behavioral patterns. Engineers recalculated designs not for compliance, but for awareness of human interdependence. Families debated ethics with a subtle, thoughtful attention to ripple effects. The philosophical sting: reality was neither rigid nor fixed. It was responsive. It was adaptive. It demanded consciousness. The man in the tower observed calmly. Intense. Reflective. Patient. He understood the paradox: the system's power lay not in control, but in reflection. Not in enforcement, but in revelation. By evening, cities hummed with new awareness. Citizens slept fitfully, dreaming not of fear, but understanding. Analysts recalculated assumptions. Engineers prepared for ripple effects they could anticipate but not fully control. And the man in the tower knew the next 5 years would be defined not by technology, but by perception. Because the truth wasn't what the system could do. It was what humans would choose once they saw it. And maybe, that choice would define a new era. The city woke under a gray sky that felt heavy with anticipation. Not chaos. Not disaster. But pressure. Conscious, relentless, unavoidable. Awareness had spread. Citizens noticed patterns, recognized consequences, questioned assumptions. Every minor decision rippled outward. Every reflection became action. And society began to strain under the weight of its own insight. You felt this before. That electric tension when knowledge demands response. That invisible tug pulling at every choice you make. Contradictions multiplied. Local and federal policies clashed. Supply chains strained unpredictably. Algorithms nudged behavior subtly yet insistently. Social media amplified uncertainty. Families argued ethics at dinner tables. Students challenged authority not for defiance, but for understanding. The moral pressure intensified. Teachers confronted students questioning the foundations of education. Engineers debated design choices knowing each adjustment could ripple unseen. Politicians corrected themselves mid-speech, aware of the amplified consequences of their words. Citizens questioned routines and norms, unsure which path was ethical. In a diner in Ohio, a waitress overheard a conversation among regulars. "This isn't chaos," one said. "It's forcing us to see ourselves." Pattern breaks escalated. Traffic shifted unexpectedly. News cycles contradicted themselves again. Algorithms suggested insights that felt uncanny. Awareness became weight. Reflection became tension. Observation became responsibility. Here's the microhook: the storm wasn't external. It was embedded in perception, in consciousness, in choice. The man in the tower watched calmly. Intense. Reflective. He knew the real storm required no spectacle. Awareness alone, deliberate, conscious, precise, was enough to challenge identity, morality, and resilience. By midday, emotional pressure peaked. Identity crises unfolded quietly but pervasively. Individuals realized their lives were intertwined with invisible forces. Communities confronted contradictions between perception and reality. Citizens wrestled with ethical dilemmas: intervene or observe, trust or question, comply or resist. You've asked this question too: what happens when an entire society sees its own scaffolding? The answer was unsettling: certainty became fragile. Reality negotiable. Identity fluid. And yet, in that uncertainty, power resided, not in the systems themselves, but in the humans perceiving them. By evening, tension reached a crescendo. Families debated ethics. Students challenged authority. Communities confronted invisible architecture. Every interaction carried weight, and awareness pressed like gravity. The philosophical sting: the storm didn't punish. It illuminated. It demanded consciousness. It revealed not weakness, but potential. Because the next 5 years wouldn't be shaped by events alone. They would be defined by choices made in the eye of this awakening. And as night deepened, the realization settled: the storm had never left. It had evolved. It existed in every reflection, every decision, every observation. Dawn arrived soft and quiet, though the city was awake in a new way. Not restless. Not uncertain. Deliberate. Conscious. Alert. The storm had passed, or at least, it had transformed. What remained wasn't chaos. It was awareness. A quiet, pervasive consciousness that had settled across neighborhoods, towns, and cities. Citizens moved with intention, thought with attention, and acted with reflection. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. Streetlights reflected off wet streets, catching in puddles where a child skipped on the way to school. Coffee cooled on diner tables as conversations shifted from complaint to curiosity. Screens glowed softly, reflecting faces deep in thought. Across offices, homes, and classrooms, people noticed patterns, questioned assumptions, and reconsidered choices. You've felt this before. That stillness after a storm, when the world seems larger, sharper, and infinitely more intricate. When you realize small acts, reading instead of scrolling, pausing instead of reacting, questioning instead of accepting, carry weight far beyond immediate perception. At a diner in Oregon, a waitress observed a conversation among locals. "We understand now," one said quietly. "It's not about control. It's about reflection." The man in the tower watched. Calm. Intense. Reflective. He knew the paradox: systems alone cannot enforce change. Awareness does. Deliberation does. Choice does. By mid-morning, subtle shifts were visible. Commuters paused at intersections, noticing traffic flow differently. Parents reconsidered instructions. Students observed small details that rippled unexpectedly. Communities adapted to patterns revealed by the storm, embedding reflection into daily life. And the philosophical echo became clear: the storm had not destroyed. It had revealed human potential. Human responsibility. Human agency. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? Even the smallest acts, speaking intentionally, listening actively, reflecting deeply, carried significance. Awareness became contagious. Curiosity purposeful. Reflection habitual. The future was no longer something that happened to people, it was something they participated in shaping. The storm's aftermath was not chaos. It was consciousness. And the man in the tower knew this: the real work had only begun. Because revelation, like freedom, is not a state. It is a practice. And somewhere, across cities, towns, diners, offices, classrooms, a subtle shift persisted, understanding that the next 5 years would be defined not by events, but by conscious human choice. And maybe, this is where everything begins again. The city woke under a sun that felt unfamiliar, yet inevitable. Not oppressive. Not uncertain. But alive. Deliberate. Conscious. 5 years had passed. Or at least, 5 years of awareness had passed. Society had not collapsed, nor had it been perfected. It had evolved. Slowly. Unevenly. Beautifully. You've seen this before. That sense when history bends quietly, subtly, beneath the weight of human choice. When change isn't violent, it is deliberate, reflective, pervasive. Communities moved differently now. Local policies reflected observation, not impulse. Education focused on thinking, not memorization. Technology adapted to human awareness, rather than the other way around. News cycles became tools of reflection, not manipulation. Families debated ethics not as an argument, but as preparation. At a diner in Kansas, a waitress noticed something ordinary, yet extraordinary. "They've changed," a patron said. "Not the system," another replied. "The people." Pattern breaks persisted, but differently. Traffic flowed intuitively. Algorithms suggested, but never coerced. Data informed reflection, not fear. Citizens made decisions with awareness of consequences, understanding that even minor acts could ripple far beyond immediate perception. The man in the tower walked through these cities, not as a ruler, not as an observer, but as someone who had witnessed choice in motion. Intense. Reflective. Human. By midday, subtle shifts were everywhere. A student questioned a lesson, not to rebel, but to refine understanding. An engineer reconsidered a design, not from fear, but from responsibility. A citizen paused mid-action, aware of its ripple effect. Every choice carried consciousness, and every awareness multiplied the potential for impact. Freedom was no longer abstract. It was practiced. Deliberately. Every day. The philosophical echo emerged: power was never in technology, rules, or structures. It was in observation. Reflection. Choice. And in that echo, the world had changed. Not uniformly. Not perfectly. But human beings, aware, conscious, deliberate, had begun to shape the system rather than be shaped by it. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over streets, diners, classrooms, offices. It illuminated ordinary choices, everyday decisions, and subtle reflections. And the realization settled: the next 5 years, like the last 5, would be shaped not by events, but by consciousness in motion. And maybe, just maybe, this is where everything truly begins. Night fell slowly, like ink spreading across a city alive with reflection. Not silent. Not empty. But conscious. A city breathing with awareness. The past 5 years had passed like a tide, carrying subtle shifts, unseen patterns, and quiet revolutions. Society had not been rewritten by chaos, by force, or by technology alone. It had been rewritten by the choices of humans, awake, deliberate, responsible. You've felt this before. That recognition that the smallest act can ripple further than imagination. That awareness is power. That reflection carries consequences deeper than action itself. Across America, everyday life bore witness to transformation. A teacher encouraged a student not only to learn, but to question. A parent guided a child not only to follow, but to observe. A journalist reported not only facts, but frameworks. An engineer designed not only structures, but understanding. At a diner in Illinois, a waitress witnessed a quiet conversation. "It's not the system," one patron said softly. "It's us," the other replied. "And we're awake." Pattern and chaos coexisted. Observation and choice intertwined. The invisible scaffolding beneath society had not vanished, it had become visible, not in architecture or code, but in consciousness. The man in the tower walked among these streets, unseen yet present. Calm. Intense. Reflective. Human. He knew the truth: power is never in enforcement. It is in awareness. Responsibility. Deliberate action. By mid-evening, subtle shifts were everywhere. A student paused mid-question, weighing the ripple of her words. An engineer reconsidered a design, aware of unseen consequences. A citizen chose reflection over impulse, understanding that the next decision could echo for years. Freedom was no longer abstract. It was practiced. Every day. Every choice. The philosophical echo emerged: the world is not shaped solely by events, technology, or power. It is shaped by human consciousness in motion. Awareness amplifies influence. Reflection drives change. Deliberation molds destiny. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? The city breathed under the stars, alive with intention, awake with responsibility. Shadows stretched long, but each one reflected choice. Every ordinary moment, a catalyst. Every quiet decision, a ripple. Every act of awareness, a spark. And the final realization settled like a whisper: the story was never about systems, algorithms, or events. It was about humans. Awake. Deliberate. Responsible. Alive. The lights flickered. A door clicked softly. A breath. A pause. And maybe, this is where everything truly begins.